Concerns about the treatment of illegal immigrants and plans to reduce corporate tax rates in the United States are just a part of the fallout from the election of Donald Trump as the 45th president of the US last week. Domestically, one of the biggest issues facing the minority government here is, of course, public sector pay as ministers try to ward off widespread industrial action. All of that, while at the same time keeping Fianna Fáil on side, because without their confidence and supply agreement, this government will fall. The leader of Fianna Fáil, leader of the opposition, Micheál Martin, is in our Cork studio. Micheál Martin, good morning to you.
Good morning, Sean.
Coming in. First of all, 6 days on from that game-changing election in the United States, Donald Trump on his way to the White House. What do you make of the story so far?
Well, I think fundamentally the lesson from the election, and I think we have to be careful, there are many factors involved here and we can't just single out one, but clearly globalisation and the impact of globalisation is changing the very shape and nature of our political discourse. In the UK, we've seen it through the Brexit, and we've seen it also in the United States in the election, I think, of Donald Trump. And you couple that with migration and the huge challenge that migration is presenting. I think you combine that and you get a very clear lesson, if you like, or message that politics is changing. And then there was a very strong rural-urban divide in the American election. So far, I think what we're witnessing, there is some evidence of moderation in the interviews that we've had compared to the comments that Donald Trump made during the election campaign itself. Comments which were not acceptable, and I said that at the time, and I say it again, in terms of, I think, stoking up the race issue, in terms of lampooning people with disabilities, in terms of people who might have opposed him at the time. And I think that said, however, one gets a sense of some moderation, but I think we have to be very concerned about the more fundamental issues. So will American foreign policy change? The trade policy, he clearly is negative about free trade agreements, the NAFTA agreement. I think TTIP is probably dead now. Ireland as a country depends on trade. We depend on a liberal trading environment across the world. We sell most of what we make here, both in products and in services. And therefore, that's a key issue for us. So an isolationist type approach in America will not help Ireland. A protectionist approach to world trade issues will not help Ireland. And they're the more fundamental points down the road that we need to be very conscious of. And then the taxation issue is a serious issue down the road as well. No point in pretending it isn't, but that's a matter for the American government. They're quite entitled to reduce the corporate tax rates. They're talking about bringing it down to 15%. Britain has brought theirs to 20%, and we'll bring it down further. And then you throw in Brexit. Britain leaving the European Union, and we have a perfect storm coming our way, which I think means we need to fundamentally reassess our industrial strategy to prepare for all of that.
Just to pick up on that point you made earlier on, Micheál Martin, about how you had been critical of Donald Trump yourself. Let's just recall briefly what you had to say in the Dáil earlier in the year.
I think in terms of the Donald Trump, you can't predict who's going to win the next American election. I accept that. But I do think we can stand up for basic principles, and I think we need to enunciate basic principles. And it is worrying, the kind of stuff that has been articulated in the United States election. It's not acceptable for Democrats to talk in the manner that Donald Trump has spoken in terms of various religions and in various ethnic groups and in terms of building walls and all the rest of it. It sets an appalling example for the way the free world should be talking and articulating in the democratic world. And I think we have, as a government and we as politicians, have to articulate that very clearly.
Well, do you keep on articulating that and at this stage, now that he is the president-elect, or do you adopt the Bertie Ahern line that he gave us last week on the morning after? We need to get over the fact that Donald Trump is now the next president, and to start love-bombing him. That's what the Irish government needs to do.
No, you keep to your fundamental principles. Very basic democratic values that we stand by, and the very reason why we exist in politics. If we surrender that, there is no point in being in politics. And by continuing to articulate what is right and what is proper, I think you bring about change, and you bring about a moderation of the views that are articulated.
How do you moderate Donald Trump?
Look, already we will see. I mean, the one thing about democracy is you have checks and balances. No one individual is all powerful in a democracy. And within the American system with Congress, you have checks and balances there. And also, it remains to be seen whether the campaign rhetoric really was just that, campaign rhetoric, or whether there will be some of that will be followed through. My sense is that in the foreign policy area, in the trade area, and in the tax area, I think he'll follow through on his instincts. And he articulated clear instincts on those particular fronts. And he has advisors and people who've been working up positions on those issues. And those are the ones really that are of particular concern, I think, in terms of the world order and in terms of how things pan out. So an example, his attitude to Europe in general, I think, is an issue. And indeed, the Asia-Pacific, the whole strategy that was being developed by the United States there, it could embolden Russia, for example, in terms of its foreign policy and in terms of how it's approaching global issues. So I think it's all there to be, to evolve, and we're not quite clear in terms of how strongly he will follow some of those issues.
And for instance, the idea of deporting up to 2 million immigrants who are undocumented or illegal. What's your sense of that? I mean, do you think? Sorry, he said between 2 and 3 million.
Yeah.
In fact, in his interview last night on 60 Minutes, is that something that would fill you with foreboding?
Well, I think it's again very imprecise in terms of the numbers, and secondly, it's not clear that many exist in terms of people with criminal records. But the most important point about that is the fear that it stokes up. In other words, there are many families in America who were there undocumented. Many Irish families, many Latinos, and so on. The first reaction, I think, of those families will be absolute fear. And that's not good in my view. That's wrong approach. And I think now again you get mixed messages from the interview. He himself, the president-elect, acknowledges there's some very fine people, and so on. But again, it's imprecise and it's not clear. But I think we need. In terms of the articulation of policy on migration, I think we need a very clear strategy from the American government, because let's remember, America was founded on migration. Inward migration into America was the very essence of how it developed and evolved as a very effective economy. And if you look at the high-tech companies, for example, the Googles and Facebooks, and I've been reading quite a lot about their reaction to this, they still depend on migration. I think over 50% of startups in Silicon Valley are started by non-Americans who come in, and these will be 50% of those over $1 billion in value. So that's all very much part of the dynamic of the American economy. And traditionally, when I met Republican politicians in the past in Capitol Hill, they were of that view that there had to be a far more, I suppose, strategic approach to the migration question, rather than just one that appeals to the emotions. Yeah,
but I'm just looking at the fact that, again, mixed signals last night, you might say, that as his chief of staff, he appointed the Republican National Committee chairman, Reince Priebus, who would be well connected on Capitol Hill. But on the other hand, his chief of staff, Steve Bannon, who is somebody who is seen as, well, to quote one of the Democrat opponents, he's a racist, fascist, extreme right-winger who is now going to be sitting literally footsteps from the Oval Office.
Yeah, I think first of all, I think Reince Priebus is a very effective appointment. I think he values him. Just reading some of this background myself, it's very clear that he credits him with, I think, building bridges with the Republican Party in the aftermath of the bruising primary season. And so I think having him as chief of staff is a very pragmatic move that in many respects is positive. The Steve Bannon appointment, less so obviously, but may indicate that Donald Trump is very conscious of the electoral impulses, if you like, that got him elected. In other words, he's had one eye on the electoral and populist dimension to his election, and another eye on effective government. And I think Reince Priebus in his appointment, I think, represents, I think, a person who wants to get things done as well.
Now, just going back, bearing in mind that you yourself have experience as Minister for Foreign Affairs, also as Minister for Trade here, again, the biggest concern is corporate tax, and lots of economists, business groups, politicians, in fact, the head of IDA just saying on the Marion Finucane show, effectively, let's not panic, even if he does slash rates in the US. We have other selling points, our location, our English-speaking and educated workforce. But surely the game has changed completely now for us, hasn't it?
It has changed, and I'm not panicking at all, and nobody should ever panic in situations like this, but we have to be hard-headed. I mean, I was in the boardrooms with pharmaceutical companies and technology companies, and the message was very clear that the corporation tax matters. Education matters. The capacity to access skills matters. And I remember being in Microsoft, and they would say to you that the single greatest ingredient for them was actually getting access to the right brain power and skills, no matter where they were located in the world. But when Britain lowers its corporate tax rate to 20%, US to 15%, the world is changing. And we have to acknowledge that and change our industrial strategy accordingly to make ourselves more competitive and to enhance those areas.
How?
Well, I think, for example, you take education and investment. We had the Cassell's report in terms of the underfunding of universities, and nothing really was done in the budget, bar 30 million. I mean, we've got to really accelerate our approach to issues like research and education, because those are our firewalls against erosion of foreign direct investment into the future. We've got to move much faster now on the research front so that we become the country that produces the products, the new solutions for the world. And also in terms of third level education, that we get up those world rankings in terms of our universities standing, and that we invest in our institutes of technology. I was at a function last week where Dick Lehan, one of the founding members of EMC in Cork, for example, said one of the first employees there. And he talked about the role of the institutes of technology, the Cork Regional Technical College at the time, in providing the skills that enabled EMC to grow into becoming one of the biggest companies in the world. So we've got to reinvent that, if you like, and get back to that as a core mission for the country. And that's how you deal with this. There's no point in sort of saying we get into the dressing room saying we're great people, we beat the All Blacks last week, and next week we're going to do it better again. We've got to be a bit more hard-headed, precise in terms of policy and in terms of acknowledging the change and the reality, because you throw Brexit into the equation and it gets worse. And could I say to Sean, like when I was Enterprise Minister, it was Switzerland you were up against, Puerto Rico in some respects, Israel in other respects, and so on. Many countries outside of the European Union. It's very clear in terms of post-Brexit to me that Britain will be doing everything it possibly can to make itself an attractive proposition. So the competitors are changing and they're closer to home than maybe they would have been historically in terms of our life sciences offering and in terms of technology. So I think we've got to be very conscious of all of that. I think the idea is up for it. I think the idea is a very strong organisation. We're fortunate in having an agency that has stood the test of time, that is resilient and has the capacity to adapt.
OK, domestically, Micheál Martin, public sector pay is probably the biggest issue facing the government in the sense that it's one that can do most about Brexit and the American election. Now, union leader after union leader has said Croke Park is dead and it looks like the government is going to have to stump up more money. I mean, just looking at John Downing's piece in the comment pages of The Independent today, the heading is Enda will buy off the public sector to hold on to power at our expense. Is that how you read it? And is he right if that's what he does?
He's not right if that's what he does. And I do read it. I think it's Lansdowne the unions are calling for, or essentially saying is dead. And I think the government has too hurriedly, in my view, begun the unwinding of Lansdowne. I think
I said Croke Park by mistake. Yes.
Okay. Because I remember Pascal Donohoe over a week ago was already talking about bringing forward the scheduling around the discussion of a successor to Lansdowne. Effectively, code for we're moving earlier. No, he denied it he denied that this meant that the new pay agreement would not come in earlier. But once you start negotiations on something that's meant to conclude in September 2018, once you start discussions immediately on that, I think you're in trouble in relation to Lansdowne. I think we need to take a reality check as a country here. We've just discussed the impact of a Donald Trump election. The Brexit issue, I think people are understating it in terms of the impact on this country. It is very serious. It fundamentally changes the economic structure of the country and the model that we've been working under for the last 45 years. It's big. It's a big decision by the British that has huge implications for our economy into the future. And I think pending a proper assessment of the impact of Brexit, we need to be very, very careful that we don't go down the road of a new pay agreement that we're simply not in a position to afford. And you add to that the fact that our manufacturing output has been down in the last month. Retail sales are not going well. Our income tax take is down. And I think then the prioritisation of services. We do need more nurses, doctors and Gardaí. The waiting lists are on a record high in the hospitals. Our housing situation is appalling. And I talked earlier about the investment in education. So I think we need to look at all of this comprehensively. And I would say to the unions and in particular, the Minister is saying tomorrow, I believe, to the Cabinet that to stand still, you need 9,000 extra recruits a year in terms of public servants, in terms of teaching and health, just to stand still in terms of demographics, in other words, the growing population and the younger population as well, and the demands that we're going to take. So I don't think the room is there, quite frankly.
Yeah, but is the room there to give the Gardaí what they were given by the Labour Court, for instance?
Well, the Labour Court has made its adjudication, and the Gardaí were always outside the industrial relations machinery, and we're outside all of the machinery that led up to Lansdowne and so on. So,
but they managed to do very well down the years with all their allowances and so forth.
That said, that cannot be used as a catalyst for
but
a whole
it is being,
series.
sure, you've heard them all.
Yeah, but the government has to stand up for the taxpayer and for everybody else. I mean, there are self-employed people out there right now who have suffered huge problems with the valuation of sterling. We have real issues now that we didn't have prior to the British vote, and I think we need to see the horizons ahead of us before we jump down the road of something that could catch us at the end.
If people like Liam Doran organise work to rules or stoppages that cause people to get very upset about things getting worse in our hospitals, or other public servants go on work to rule or take industrial action, are you saying if the government stands firm, you'll stand right behind them and be every bit as firm?
Well, we stood firm behind the Lansdowne Road agreement. It's the government buckled before the opposition on that one. Notwithstanding the fact that 6 or 7 months ago, the Fine Gael side were very adamant that we would have to sign up for Lansdowne prior before they would accept the confidence and supply agreement. I think the government has allowed things drift.
Have they gone soft? Is that what you're saying?
They have, but they've allowed things get into crisis mode. They shouldn't have allowed the Gardaí issue get to where it got to. That could have been nipped in the bud much earlier, in my opinion. But they left, for example, the Public Service Pay Commission, which we agreed to with the government, it was too late in getting itself established. The government just lost about 4 or 5 months on that. A lot of these issues could have been dealt with well in advance. We know Garda morale was very low 2 to 3 years ago, never mind the last couple of months. And there should have been earlier interventions in terms of dealing not just with the pay issue, but wider issues to do with An Garda Síochána and that wasn't done. Now, my view is that we got elected in the election to improve services. I mean, I think public servants, if you're a young public servant or a young worker, whether you're public or private, your biggest issue in many respects, if you get a job in Dublin, for example, it's rents. So the government should concentrate on getting down costs for workers. And the most basic cost is housing at the moment, particularly rents, which is tearing the bulk of salaries of young workers. You take car insurance as the other. I mean, those two issues, car insurance and housing rents, are killing young workers, be they in the private or public sector. Deal with those in an aggressive, interventionist manner. We did it before in car insurance with the Personal Injury Assessment Board, PIAB, in the mid-2000s, and it was very effective in getting car insurance down. Take health costs. Let's start bringing down health costs in terms of both the amount of money that people have to pay out for medicine and in terms of prescription charges and so on. And I think you get that would be far more effective and impactful on take-home pay than people chasing single-digit percentages that in the end of the day get swallowed up in one insurance increase.
Micheál Martin, leader of Fianna Fáil, thank you very much indeed for joining us from our Cork studio.